Greetings, exporters. Welcome to our webinar today. IBT Online is proud to present Digital Compliance for International Exporters. Thank you all for joining us, and we're delighted to have you here to talk about digital compliance, what that means for your websites, for social media, and so on. So let's get started right away. But just while we're waiting for the last few people to log on, a couple of moments on housekeeping. What we'd like to do is talk to you about just a very brief housekeeping. So this webinar, today's webinar will be 45 minutes long. We'll have some polls during today's webinar. So we would like your participation. Get your mouse ready to click on the answers that apply to you. We will have a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. And again, we really welcome your questions. Just put them into the chat box, and one of us will be curating the questions and getting back to you. And if we run out of time, we will email you with responses as well. About 2 days from now, on Friday, check your inbox because you'll be getting a recording of the webinar. If you've enjoyed it, if you'd like to share it, go ahead. If you want to have more questions or want to get in touch with us, just send us an email or ring us up. We'd love to hear from you. Very important for us, and a real big favor, if you could please answer the very brief survey at the end of this webinar. So at the very end, when I click end of webinar, a survey will pop up on your box. I think there are 5 questions. It's really short. It's like, what are your main target destinations? What are your main issues you have exporting, and so on. So I'd really appreciate your participation in the survey, and that's at the end here. So otherwise, you don't need to take notes. You'll be sent a recording. You can sit back, enjoy, listen, and participate with polls and questions. And there you go. Let's talk about digital compliance. So here today to talk about digital compliance is myself. My name is Susanna, and I'm Chief Content Officer at IBT Online. I've been with IBT Online now for many years, and I think it's just interesting because the role that I have has changed over time as content has become so vital for websites and social media and the whole way that interaction happens online. And I'm really pleased to have Joelle Nazarotto join us today. She's our Senior Online Marketing Manager. Joelle runs campaigns across the globe. In all different kind of social media channels across paid, SEO, SMM, everything possible across the world, and has a very diligent team helping her for all parts of online marketing, and is here. And Joelle has joined me here to help out on some of those big questions as digital compliance and marketing go hand in hand. 2 seconds on who we are as a company. So IBT Online. IBT stands for International Business Technologies. We are a US company, although we've got offices in Europe and outreaches in China, the Middle East, in Latin America. And we are 100% focused on supplying, providing, supporting businesses with online tools. So what that means in practice is that we build websites internationally. We manage those websites, and we do online marketing and social media across the globe. So international, digital, that's our sphere. We're very proud to have won some awards and things, and we've helped over. We've got over. Actually, it's more like 500 companies now that we've helped with online tools. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about digital compliance just in general, just sort of set the scene, and then a couple of the major must-haves, and then we wanted to drill into sort of like who's who in who does what, who's responsible for what in digital compliance. The fourth part will give you some case studies, a little bit of sort of here's some solutions, here's a roadmap of what to do. The key issues, and then finally just some brief takeaways and your questions. So we've packed an awful lot into a very short time. Again, if you'd like us to drill down on any of these specific items, get back in touch with us and we will. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about digital compliance to start with. Before we, and just set the scene, just to set the scene, we thought we'd just look at the digital world today. This is taken in April 2019. The next update from Hootsuite and Real Social will be coming in, I think, within another 2 weeks' time. But I think April 2019 is still worth looking at. 7.5 billion people on the earth, awful lot of them. 5 billion of them are using mobile phones. 4.5 billion are online. And when Hootsuite measures this, they really do take online in a major way. It's like online for a lot of the time. And one of the interesting things that I think as well is the majority of those, by the way, are using are active social media users. And one of the things I think about that's interesting is that this is still a growth market. In 2019, the number of people online grew by 9%. With these big numbers, that's a very meaningful lot. As a sort of nearly 400 million people going online for the first time. So it is really it is ubiquitous. It is across the globe, everywhere, and it's beginning to start to mature. This is no longer the Wild West of 30 years ago when the website was when the web was sort of introduced. One of the key things that the web does for your business, the web and using online tools forces you to be ever more customer-centric, customer-aware, customer-centric, putting the customer at the center, because the customer now has a lot more control over data, over comments, over your brand, your reputation. They have a lot more visibility. If before buying from you, they could well investigate, go online, go to their WhatsApp groups, say, hey, you ever bought anything from these guys? Check you out. They will go online. The majority of your customers and your prospects will go online and check you out before buying from you. So part of the buyer's journey is the online part of it. And that's also where digital compliance comes in so much. And we'll talk about that in particular. So what is, another way of putting this customer-centric view of the world is to say, for the buyer's journey, awareness, which is typically seen as awareness, consideration, decision. Each one of those stages of the buyer's journey is now heavily influenced by the internet. They become aware of you because of your online presence. They consider you because of what they see online, social media. They investigate other people on their WhatsApp, and they'll take a decision, online decision, very often. Therefore, those localized websites, especially if you're in international markets, you're going to need a localized website, and the online marketing to be found allows you to get found and be understood and do business. So that's what I think is so important here. The key for your international exporters, for you guys here today doing international work, is this word localization as well. So in the buyer's journey for your export markets, you need to make sure that you're found locally, understood locally, and doing business locally. And that means what's called a localized website. I'm going to say very briefly what that means, and the best way that I can of understanding that is really to go back to basics. How do search engines work? Search engines, Google is by far the dominant player across the world. They've got something like 70% market share across the world, something like that. 67% market share in the US, like 95% market share in Europe, 97% market share in most of Latin America. The big holes that they don't have, China, Russia, and then a couple of other markets like South Korea. So, Google, let's take a look at Google. Now, if you think of Google, think of it not as one huge company where one website does all. Think of Google as 192 separate Googles. Google India can be in English or in other languages, but let's say it's in English. It's different from Google USA because Google is customer-centric, searcher-centric. Therefore, Google India says, what is important for my searcher? Your website based in, Utah, selling whatever it is you're selling, is not relevant for my person sitting here in Hyderabad or Mumbai, because it's not localized. It's not using Indian keywords. It's not hosted here. You don't have a it's just not around here. Therefore, you have to have a localized website. Now, there's a lot that goes into localized websites. We've done a lot of webinars about that. I'd encourage you to have a look at some of those webinars if you want to drill down more. But there's one thing I wanted to talk about now, and that is being understood in building trust via compliance and digital online regulations and recognition. So building trust, again, going through this buyer's journey, it's really important to have that trust in order to actually, progress your buyer from awareness into decision. Digital compliance we see as a core element to that trust. So a localized website will have the right keywords. It'll be relevant to the local market. It'll be the right language. It'll be culturally appropriate. It'll also have the right digital compliance for that market. If you have a website that's targeting Europe, let's say you're targeting Germany, and you build it in German and you host it in Germany and it's up there in Germany, if you are not digitally compliant, there is a large warning sign that goes up on your website for any German looking at it. And I'll show you an example of that later. So there you go. Digital compliance for us is one of those key elements for building the trust that you need for the buyer's journey. So just in a nutshell then, if we were to summarize this part, we can say, website localization and online marketing that goes with it is customer-centric. I've listed here on the right the key elements that we get for a localized website. But we wanted just to say, these are major things, and one of the major parts about it, regulatory requirements, digital compliance. Now, there's a lot of history about digital compliance. There's and GDPR is right up there, but you can see that there's a lot of different parts of digital compliance. Privacy, cookie policies. There's the brand new California Consumer Privacy Act that was introduced in January 2020. There's anti-spam legislation in Canada. There's India personal data protection. So there's a lot of different things that are now happening. Now, some of it happened already a decade ago, but this is definitely gaining momentum. And we're seeing a lot of other countries going in there and saying, okay, we need this too. Next on our list is Japan, Colombia, Australia, Brazil, a lot of places looking at introducing some sort of compliance there. Now, before we talk more in detail about the compliance, I wanted to raise a quick poll. And so, get your hands ready on those mice. And I wanted to ask you all, do you already have localized websites for your export markets? Do you have localized websites? Do you have them for only a few export markets? Are you thinking about them? Do you have them for all your export markets? And let me give you some feedback. We haven't had everybody voting yet. Not everybody's up there. Okay, thank you. We're starting to get some people coming in. I could say it's about evenly split. Evenly split between yes, but only for a few export markets, and well, actually, no, it's changed all the time. Let me give you an update now. Sorry. The majority of you have localized websites for your for a few export markets. Otherwise, you're thinking about it, and a very, very few have for all export markets. But evenly split between only a few export markets and thinking about it. Thank you very much for that poll. That was a test run. There'll be 3 other polls a bit later. So let's now talk about online digital compliance. And the compliance of what we call the must-haves. And the must-haves, what are these things that unite all those different kinds of policies that we're seeing everywhere? I thought I'd take this up as an example. For me, the California Consumer Privacy Act is the very latest one. That was introduced as law in 1st of January 2020, so it's brand new. It was first adopted by the governor in, I think it was July 2018, but now actual law. And I thought the advertisement for it was very interesting, because here you have 3 images, and this was very much put out by the California state, advertising it and letting people know about it. And there were 3 messages they wanted to give their consumers and their voters. The first was that the CCPA gives you, the voter, the consumer, ownership, it gives you control, and it gives you security. And those are 3 words that you'll find throughout all of the online digital compliance acts everywhere in the world. So really those three themes punctuate all of the policies that you'll see. So ownership, this notion of ownership. Data is now recognized as a valuable asset. So who owns the asset? The point about a digital compliance law is the recognition that the subject, in other words, the data subject, you, the consumer, for example, the data subject owns its data. So you might be giving it to somebody, Google, Amazon, Facebook, to use for a little while, but you own it. Therefore, you have rights about it, which is the control part. You have the right to investigate it, comment on it, ask it to be ignored, whatever. And you have the right for it to be securely managed. Those are the 3 concepts that you'll find throughout all of them. Now, let me just finish up here on the CCPA. There's a couple of sort of the essentials of the California Consumer Privacy Act, is that you have the right to know, the consumer has the right to know what personal information is collected, how it's used and shared and sold. You also have the right to delete personal information held by businesses, and also the business service providers. You have the consumer has the right to opt out of the sale of that personal information. So you can direct a business that sells personal information to stop selling that information. And businesses are subject to the CCPA if any one of the following 4 attributes apply. So any one of these 4. 1, you've got annual revenue in excess of $25 million. Or you buy or receive or sell personal information of at least 50,000 or more consumers. 3, you get more than 50% or more of your annual sales from selling that information, consumers' and personal information. And so there you go. So those are the 4 sort of key, and of course that you serve Californian consumers. It's interesting, all companies that serve California residents that have this, it's any California consumer can demand that for that. Companies don't have to be based in California, and they don't have to have a physical presence there to fall under that law. They don't even have to be based in the United States. So again, that's one of the items that you'll see again and again in a lot of the different policies encapsulated in the CCPA as well as in GDPR, is that the notion is that these are global regulations and apply to the world. California might be saying this applies to Californians, but it applies to anybody who markets, who does this, to anyone from California. You'll see the same thing in GDPR. So these are global regulations. I did want to say there's an interesting little thing here which I noted when I went on the California legislative information to look at the finer details of this. I was a little bit amazed. This is a California state web page for the legislation, and there's something I'm sitting here in Europe, so I'm like GDPR infused. So when I see this, I'm amazed because it's not a secure website. How can you have a not secured website for the legislator of the California government? Amazing to me. But there you go. That's an example of how not to be digitally compliant for a European. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about European websites. Again, I said that a lot of these websites, sorry, a lot of these digital compliance legislations come from somewhere. There's lots of things that's come before the GDPR. There's things like the 1995 EU Data Protection Act and so on. So there's lots of different ones that have come before that. Some of the earliest dating from the mid-90s. It got to be quite a mess. It got to be hard to understand what applied to what, to whom rather, and how to enforce any of these things. And that's why the GDPR was put in place, in order to make it a single act that covers all countries within the EU. Let's have a quick reminder of what the EU is. It's about to change in about a week's time because the UK is leaving it. Amazing, but there you go. Not get into that discussion. At the moment, it's 28 countries. As of next week, it's 2 weeks time, it's 27 countries. It's about 500 million inhabitants. It's the 500 million inhabitants, 433 million internet users, and it has always really led the vanguard about GDPR, digital compliance. It was the one who introduced privacy policies in the beginning. Safe harbor is a European notion. So it's no surprise that they've put in place this GDPR, which we'll get onto in a second. A quick look then at Europe Online. What does that mean? Europe Online, this is actually a slightly different number of counting of Europe, because they've not counted the EU, they've counted total Europe, which includes a lot of the countries like that are not within the EU. So that 500 million that we saw in the EU is now become 850 million for nevertheless, in terms of internet users, 80%, and that corresponds, that's actually slightly lower than the EU average. The EU average is more like about 90% across the EU. But just to give you some quick overview of the online. So it basically, just like the previous slide we saw about the online world, everybody's online. So the objective, as I said, of the GDPR was to have a single set of European rules. This applies for everybody across all countries across that, and it means that you can have an entity which actually has some bite. So there can be real fines applied. The core objectives of the GDPR was, again, this right of control, and that you got the rights, and those rights were respected. There's real sanctions in case of non-compliance, and it applies throughout the EU, including it applies, again, we're seeing this as a global regulation. If you're European or non-European, if you're a processor who's processing personal data of European citizens, you have to comply with this. The sanctions can be severe. They can be up to 20 million euros, up to 4% of a company's global revenues, whichever is higher. Today, for example, an Italian energy company was fined 11 million euros for transgressing this. I think the day after GDPR was introduced, this legislation in May last year, Google was fined 57 million euros. So, these things are coming through and are being applied. They are very much looking at the top level of companies to start with. GDPR, the main question we get is, does it apply to me if I'm not a European company? And the answer is yes. It applies to anybody, just like that California CCPA, just like the other ones that we're seeing introduced in the world. It applies to anybody who processes any personal data of any EU data subject. Any company inside or outside the EU. And can you transfer data outside the EU? No, you cannot if you're not GDPR compliant. So if you think, okay, I've just got my database in Europe, I can take that back into the States and use it. No, that's also prohibited. Okay, so that's worth keeping in mind. Just quickly, what is data and under GDPR, and what is processing? Processing data means anything, including automated. It means the collection and storage and hosting, transferring, erasure, everything that involves the data. So all aspects of your business, from selling to invoicing to after sales to storing to whatever it is, it's all there. That's processing. Personal data for GDPR is very much about the natural person. So it's about the person itself. That's important because it's a narrower definition than the CCPA. The Californian one has a slightly larger view of what constitutes data. What is not personal data, and this is something that you'll see across all the digital compliance regulations you're seeing, anything that is not personal data, for example, info at, sales at, or anonymous data, where you really cannot identify who the person is behind the person applying that, and any direct company information rather than personal. So again, it is what is not personal data becomes quite obvious. The main rights, as we talked about before, the right to be forgotten, the right to view your data, the right to make changes, and portability. That means I want to take my data away from you and give it to someone else. I no longer want you to have my data. I want to transfer my data to someone else. Right, that's a quick whirlwind tour of CCPA and GDPR. And those same big tenets apply to all the other things that are being rolled out in terms of digital compliance. Now, a quick poll again, just to ask you where your company is or where you think you are on the sort of curve of digital compliance. Are your company, are your websites digitally compliant? Are you aware of the problems? Yes, for your home website, not sure. A lot of you seem to be not very sure. That's a bit worrying, but we're very happy to see you on the webinar. A lot of you are also aware of the problems, which is great for that. But indeed, what we are seeing is that a lot of you are aware of the problems, and that's why you're on the webinar, and we're here to help. Thank you so much. I'm going to close that poll, but thank you very much for that. And now let's talk about digital compliance in terms of who is who in the digital compliance world. A quick rundown. The notion of a controller or a processor is key to digital compliance. Whether it's in the CCPA or the GDPR or what's being rolled out in India or anywhere else, this notion of someone who controls the data or someone who processes the data. So a controller is the one who takes the lead. This means that when you're gathering personal data, the controller makes you aware that the data is being collected. And as a controller, you've got to ask for very explicit consent. So in case you ask for consent, the well-known opt-out system, as most of you might have done in the past, that no longer applies. You actually have to ask, do you agree to this? You can't just say, tick this box if you don't agree, or whatever. Now, the processor is the person who gets instructions, or the entity that gets instructions from the controller. For example, if you have an e-commerce site, you are a controller of data. Your data that you get in from the people who shop with you is the data that you're controlling. You then give that data to people like, for example, a payment gateway or logistics provider. So you'll give it to someone who's doing the payments and external service, or someone who's doing, a UPS. A UPS would be, for example, a processor for you. So those are the sort of the main difference: a controller and a processor. And I'll get back to this in a moment, but I think that's important to delineate. The key roles and duties of responsibilities of a controller, as I said, is informing the data subject, the consumer, or in other words, of the processing activity. In other words, that you are collecting the data. So you have a privacy statement, you have a pop-up, you have a contact us form, and so on. You honor their rights, the right to be forgotten, the right to change, the right to be deleted, the portability, all those rights we noted that each different type of policy has. And you are responsible for data breach, recognition, and notification. In the event of a data breach, and this becomes really important for every single data compliance that you'll find, is this notion of what happens if your data is breached. The key duties of the processor is to make sure that they are complying with the controller, that they are a safe service provider for the controller to use, so that you're staying within the boundary of the instructions and you're existing it. Those are the main activities of the processor. It's important, therefore, to know that a controller can only work with a GDPR compliant processor. And most of the time, you should be asking for proof of compliance. The relationship between controller and processor has to take the form of a written agreement, including all clauses in the GDPR, obligation of the controller, obligation of the processor, and so on. So, but in short, a processor follows the instructions of the controller. I'm going to turn now to Joelle, just to talk to us a little bit about what that means for marketing. Joelle?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Susanna, and great to be here today. Hello, everyone. Great to have the opportunity to talk about international online marketing and how really to be digitally compliant. So now, well, the slides I have here is a little bit too text heavy, but I just wanted to illustrate something important here. So what you can see is really a list of typical marketing campaigns for international exporters. So depending on where your brand is, where your company is, you'll have different campaigns depending on what you want to achieve and what your ambitions are in a specific market. So for instance, if you are new to the market, trying to enter a new market space, you might just want to initially concentrating on brand awareness and growing your brand in the new market. But for example, if you're a well-established brand and have an in-market distributor, then you might actually want to focus on driving leads to that distributor. So generating conversion and collecting data. And that's what we're talking about international marketing today, because whatever your campaign, all involves is collecting data. So arguably, we can say that marketing really has two objectives for a company, which are building brand awareness and collecting data to eventually fuel your sales. So looking at collecting prospect data, so we know that online marketing is affected by digital compliance purely for the reason because you do collect personal data. Whichever your marketing strategy, you'll end up collecting some data or another. But let's think about here, what kind of data do you typically collect and how do you do so? So digital compliance really affects online marketing, as the main objective of the marketing is leads generation. So here I've just provided a few examples of different forms that are found on websites, so it doesn't necessarily have to be just your contact us page. Forms are scattered around the website, could be on a sidebar, could be a pop-up that comes up. And so in other words, collecting personal data and then storing this into your CRM, which is also an important part, as Susanna mentioned, is not just gathering the data, but it's also how you process those, how you store them, how you retain them. All obviously with the idea that then yourself or your salespeople can then circle back to these prospects, make the most of this data to then pick up this conversation and continue guiding them through that buyer journey we mentioned at the beginning. So a lot of marketing campaigns are actually indeed about putting information out there, for example, on social media, to try and get a reaction. And this reaction means you get personal data. So in this case, personal data can be names, email addresses, companies they work for, maybe personal interest. If you run a specific campaign on a specific platform, there might be how the person actually connected to that marketing campaign. That is also personal data if it allows you to identify someone through that specific data. But this could also be images and photos, for example, which is another quite controversial part of making sure that everything and everyone is always compliant. And I've mentioned here social media. Social media is a great place to start an interaction really with a prospect or even your current customers, but it's also a fantastic space to build relationship and, as we mentioned, trust. So let's say now you've collected this data, and here is where the digital compliance part really comes in. So the first thing you should ask yourselves are, do the data subject know that we have this data, that you have their data, and do they agree with it? But also, what do you do with the data? So the two are really obviously connected. We want to make sure that your prospects or whoever you collect the data from are informed of what you're going to do with the data, and then you can think about how you store it and how you process it and how you take and retain this data. So in this case, data subject is very likely to agree to give you data if you, in this case, the marketeer, are doing something helpful and that they want you to do, like telling them something interesting or really helping with a business issue. And they'll be then less likely to be pleased if the marketeer is actually doing something that is not in their interest, like, for example, selling their data. And that's when you start getting all of those nice spammy emails in your inbox when your data has been passed on and you were not quite aware that that's what's going to happen. So in this case, here we really wanted to show that, going back to what the California Consumer Privacy Act mentioned in terms of ownership, control, and security, here ownership really equals respect, control equals trust, and this together with security really leads to successful business, continued business, and happy customers and happy prospects as well.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you very much, Joelle. Whirlwind tour of why digital compliance is absolutely key to your social media and online marketing. That brings me to my third poll. Does your business use online marketing today? Do you use it for your domestic sites? Do you use it for your international businesses? Are you thinking about it? Very happy to see that a lot of you are using it for your domestic. Not that many. Oh no, it's coming up. Sorry, I spoke too soon. Now a bit more people are voting. Okay, we pretty evenly split actually now between yes for our domestic and our international websites, and yes, but only for our domestic websites. With a few more still left to vote. That's very interesting because that means that some of you are using online marketing without having a localized website. That's an interesting way to go about it in terms of effectiveness. But hey, good to see that you're all, so many of you engaged, the vast majority of you are engaged in online marketing. Happy to see that. Right, I'm gonna whiz on because we've still got a lot of things to cover. We wanted to give you some case studies or some solutions, or at least the sort of beginnings of a roadmap for digital compliance. Some of those first steps that we talked about, and we get a little bit dry on this part. There's fewer images, but basically they come down to, I'd say, 3 core areas. The first is about the who, which is appointing a person, appointing someone to take charge. And I'll define that, what I mean after that. Then the who, are you a controller or a processor? Or, who's who? Are you, what are you processing? What are you controlling? And then registering what the processing activities actually are. The core then, in terms of the work that has to be done, is what's called data mapping and also policies. And then there's the last bit, which is making sure that you have all the agreements and procedures and policies in place. Now let us give you a little bit of an example. And actually, this is like the first time that we use ourselves as an example, because we were looking at this and saying, well, we've done this actually for quite a few companies now, but in many ways, we had to discover this on our own in the beginning. Now, GDPR actually came in 2016. And like most people in 2016, we went, oh no, this looks awful. Please, can we just avoid this? And we sort of stuck our head in the sand for a little while. But then we figured, you know what, this is actually really important. This is core to our business. We better start understanding this fast. And therefore, we took it on board actually quite early. And we worked it up for ourselves in terms of our own company. Where do we stand? We're not going to be able to advise clients and really help our clients unless we understand it and think that it's core, understand the competencies, and regulate it for ourselves. And we found the first thing we found really was that we're both a controller and a processor. And this is worth thinking about in your own terms as well for your own company. We're a controller because we do our own online marketing. You all subscribe to a webinar and filled out a form. That's for us. And we collected your data and we are storing it very carefully. We are also a service provider in Europe, and we have European employees. So we provide services to companies in Europe, and we have European data on our employees. We have clients in Europe, and therefore we have data on those clients as individuals as well. All this means that we have European data. We are therefore a controller. But the core of our business, of what we do, is much more as a processor. What we do, we build international websites. We manage international websites. We do international online marketing and social media, and we help our clients with online compliance. So we do online tools for international business. That's what our IBT stands for. So all those is as a service provider, which is a processor. I'm going into some detail there because I'm hoping it helps you understand where you are on that spectrum. Are you a controller or processor, and where you are on that and how you act on that. So let's delve into that case study a bit more. So this is the first thing we did. The first thing we did, and I've divided up what we did in terms of six action items. The first thing we did was basically appoint someone directly responsible within IBT. It had to be someone senior. It had to be someone who knew a lot about the business from all different aspects, whether it's from someone who knew about the sales part, the finance part, who was able to go into various divisions and say, hey, senior management, I want some time, take me seriously. The next one, to define our role, as I mentioned before, controller, processor, and what does that mean in each case in terms of our responsibilities. The third thing we did, which was very important, is to educate our staff. GDPR concerns all aspects of a company. Data seeps in every aspect. It goes into your finance, your after sales, your marketing, everywhere, your IT team, your support team, everywhere. And that comes us to number 4, which is absolutely vital and probably the hardest part, mapping data. Where does data go in? Where does it go around? Where does it come out in a company? And then reviewing policies, data collection, management, security, data breach, most importantly. And then finally, scheduling regular reviews. And for us, we appoint a data protection officer. Let me give you another case. And here, again, we sort of amalgamated a couple of different cases together, different companies together, because we thought it'd be more useful for you to see this way. We basically said we've done this with quite a few companies. Typically, we're asked, we've taken a US company that exports to Europe. You sell via distributors. You're mid-sized, and you're wondering what to do. What you do, you sell online. You have online marketing. You've got social media. You go to trade shows. You've got logistic partners. You've got partners like us because you've got websites. So you've got some processors too. The first 3 things to do, very similar to us. Appoint someone who's going to take this over. Appoint someone who's going to do this as a job. It doesn't have to be a full-time job, but they've got to be a senior person. You don't necessarily need a qualified data protection officer unless your job is buying and selling marketing data, or you're doing a real huge amount of process. And again, we can do a breakout session on that if you want. Most companies, most mid-sized companies, will not need an individual data protection officer. It's enough to have someone who is very aware of the process within the company. Then determine your role, controller, processor, and your responsibilities that go with that role. Then thirdly, educate your employees. Share this webinar, if nothing else. The 4th step, that really hard part, is mapping your data. Where is it? Where do you collect it? Where do you store it? And I can tell you, it gets around. It gets around like dust in a living room. It gets around everywhere. It is just, you'd be surprised. You think you've got it all on a CRM? No, it's everywhere. Some bits of scrap paper, Excel spreadsheets that get, brought in and out of CRMs. And this is an interesting exercise to do. It's a great housekeeping exercise. because it really will teach you as well about any slack that you might have in the company. It's actually a really, really good way to do it. I'd say there's two things that you want to be very wary of. The one is buying in databases. In a sense, GDPR, just like the CCPA, and a lot of the other compliance things, is sort of the death of bought-in anonymous databases. If you have a database, how do you know that they've complied to be in that database? So there has not been an opt-in. Therefore, that database cannot be marketed to if it's European. And the other big thing is, how is your data stored? Is it stored securely? So those are the biggest problems in data mapping. Where is the data in there? Do you have consent, and do you have real compliance for your databases, and how are you storing them? The next steps, inform all your processors. Get together with, ask UPS how they're feeling about data compliance. Ask, monkey surveys and all the rest, and MailChimp and so on, how they did, because those are all processors. Ask us if we're managing your websites. Well, we've already done it with if that's the case. And then get some procedures out there, notably data breach. In the event of data breach, in the event that UPS is hacked and gets their data stolen, including yours, what do you do? And again, there are, we can help you design policies for that if you want. And then make sure that you're reviewing it regularly. And finally, shout about it. Say, yes, we are compliant. We respect your data. This is good thing. This is good news. This is great news for your clients. They will trust you more. Which brings me back to Joelle. Joelle?
Fantastic. Thank you, Susanna. And yes, I think this just links in really nicely with what Susanna just mentioned in terms of shout about it, make sure people know that you have everything covered, you're compliant, you understand the right, you understand your obligations. And this is also important when a prospect is navigating through your marketing landing pages. Here again, I've gone back to our IBT, our own website, the resources and how we collect data, just because, as Susanna mentioned, we've done a lot of work ourselves to make sure we understand this, make sure we are compliant, to then be able to best provide advice and help to companies to make sure they are compliant as well. So here, if we think back again to the previous section where we discussed how data is collected, we looked at an example of a contact form on a website. So here I think there are different parts of a website that maybe get forgotten about a little bit, where actually data is collected. And here we've got two examples of a pop-up form that only appears to new users, for example. So if myself that look at these pages on a daily basis go on it, I wouldn't see it, so I might forget about it. And also smaller, shorter contact form alongside our infographics and blogs that by all means please do go and have a look, because there are plenty of resources. But we have a daily or a weekly notification when new blogs are updated. But here you can see what I just wanted to show you is that having a general privacy policy in place might not be enough, but it's important to have it there, make it clear on the page when people register, giving them the option to, if they want to click on the privacy policy, read it and consent to receiving marketing information. So you need to make sure you have a clear and transparent section in your privacy policy that actually relates to data collected via your contact form scattered across the website. So this is important to show to prospects, to users on your website, that you're compliant, and you need to tell them what data, why you're collecting that data, and how you're planning on using them. So again, as I said, make sure you're clear, transparent, and make sure you shout about it. Clearly display it on the page. This will really help build that trust that we spoke about earlier, really lead into successful relationship building. And the same really applies to any data you might be collecting through social media. So at this point, you'll be pleased to know, so a nice light light at the end of the tunnel, you'll be pleased to know that if you use social media organically, so this includes, for example, things like posting content on your company page and engaging your audience on that specific page, but you don't really engage in advertising or collecting data directly, the platforms have got you covered. So big social media players like Facebook or LinkedIn, Twitter, now all have global privacy settings that are GDPR and digitally compliant. So this can be a big weight off your marketeers' shoulders, as this means that also when you're looking at advertising or generating leads via these specific platforms, they have actually taken care of making sure that all of these efforts that happen on the specific platform themselves are compliant. But how do they do this is actually by asking you, or in a way forcing you. Without doing that, you wouldn't be able to make use of the paid services. They ask you to share your privacy policy and relevant links with the consumer from the very start, so even before they reach your website. So here I was just giving you a couple of examples from a lead generation campaigns and ads setup that you could do on Facebook and LinkedIn, which is something that we do quite often for our clients. So here you can see Facebook, for example, will ask you to include a customer disclaimer, and we'd ask you to include a consent checkbox. LinkedIn will ask you for the URL to your privacy policy, and they will ask you to include a little text at the end of your ad, just making sure that the user that will see that know exactly what they're getting themselves into when they're filling out the form, before this is stored, before they even get onto your website at all. So this really means, again, that transparency, which is so important, is built in within the social platforms, offer consumers more confidence about the way they're sharing data on the platform. But this also requires you to have these in place before you start making any, really being playing around with social media. So that's very important. And here again, you have to make sure that within your privacy policy, you have a specific section about social media, how you're going to use data gathered by social media, and so on and so forth, similar to what we've discussed for a contact form on your website or any other data that you gather and store in your CRM system. And depending on the size of your team, you might actually want to consider having an internal social media policy, which would then be a detail of how members of the organization or how members of your marketing team will then use, store, and care for social media source personal data, just making sure not just your consumer, but your teams as well are all on the same page, really being super compliant and avoiding any issues moving forward.
Joelle, thank you very much. Again, a lot packed into our slides. Thank you very much on that. We wanted to make this also not like an endless diatribe of how awful how much work it is to be digitally compliant. We also want to say digitally compliance is really actually an opportunity. Don't only think of it as hard work and a challenge. It's also a serious opportunity. It's an opportunity for you guys, for everybody in your company, to get more efficient. GDPR, for example, is a single set of rules for all of the EU. And within your company, your data mapping will help you become more efficient. It'll also help you focus on which are your processors that you like, which of them are performing well. It makes you focus more on your best leads. Your contacts specify exactly what they want from you, which is not a bad thing. And you'll have to clean up that database that's been hanging around for years, and you've got some dead contacts in there. And finally, the real opportunity is that you are building the trust for that. So it's not just a chore of work. It is also an opportunity, a business opportunity for you to push the buyer's journey in the right way. So now, takeaways and Q&A. We've left a few minutes. We've got a lot of questions coming in, I'm glad to see. Quick takeaways. Our first takeaway: get yourself localized websites and international online marketing if you want to do business in an international world. The world is online. I think our first slide showed you, 7.5 billion people, 4.5 billion of them are online all the time. So everybody's going to look for you online. Make sure that you have the right online presence for your international markets. The second point that we want you to take away is that all online business is customer-centric. Therefore, you need localized websites and localized social media and online marketing. responses for your export markets in order to be customer-centric. Then in terms of digital compliance, I think we've talked nonstop about that, and I want to get you through to some questions. We have put out a few helpful resources. Please go to our website. We've done a lot of work on GDPR, a lot in the blogs and on the webinar section. If you go to that www.ibtonl, there's a whole section for resources. We wanted to give you this little infographic also about social media for exporters across the world. It might be interesting. And then two references that we like a lot is the marketing software company HubSpot, and of course Hootsuite that we've mentioned a couple of times in this slide. So, questions as we're running out of time. A quick question for you, Joelle, and it's a very simple one. Yes. About privacy policy. Do I need a separate privacy policy for our social media? So we've got one for our company. Do I need a separate one for social media?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. And I hope you were pleased to know that, no, you don't actually need a separate privacy policy for social media. But as I mentioned, do make sure that you have a clear and transparent section within your main company privacy policy. Really, again, outlining, it might be a repetition of what you already have for contact form, but just outline what kind of data you're looking to gather, what's the purpose of gathering that data, how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be retained, and so on and so forth. But it can all be included within the same privacy policy.
Thanks. Two quick questions. One is, yes, you will be getting a copy of the slide deck in your inbox on Friday. Occasionally it goes to spam, but it shouldn't. But please look out for it on Friday. You'll be getting a recording of the webinar. That's a quick question. I've got about 4 times, so I thought I'd answer that one. And another question, I've got a couple of different questions. I'm amalgamating them. I've used US here a lot as an example, but when I talk about, for example, GDPR, if I say, you know, does this apply to US companies? Yes, it also applies to Canadian companies or Japanese companies. It applies to any company in the world. It does not only apply to European companies. I just used the statement America, or USA rather. Equally for all the other aspects of the GDPR that I mentioned. There's quite a few questions about Canada digital compliance, and that is an anti-spam regulation. This webinar here, basically, you know, we just have 50 minutes. So what we did was we took the top 2 ones that we're seeing right now. If you've got GDPR, then you're compliant for all the other ones, with a few minor adjustments for California. So, you know, there's you know, you could basically get away with, you know, all the other compliance and regulations everywhere else if you've got GDPR. Another question I have, which I'm going to throw out to Joelle, is about images. This is a detailed question, but I think it's worth highlighting. We get it quite often. We're a US company. We go to a lot of trade shows in Europe. Does this mean I can't post images, photos? Joelle, why don't you get that one?
Okay, yep. I think this is a question we get quite often, and it's a bit of a tough one because it really depends on the image itself. So from trade show, according to GDPR, you shouldn't be able to identify individual through a photo without their written consent. So this opt-in we were talking about earlier. However, if you go to a trade show and you take a photo of your booth with a number of people, you're quite far away, it's not clearly identifiable, you should be okay to, you know, post it on your social media company page, for example. But do be careful if you have a staff that's having a one-to-one with a specific customer, then you might need to ask them for their written permission before you use that photo anywhere outside of that specific trade show.
Great. The whole notion of images and so on is actually very, very important and a little bit murky in the whole GDPR and compliance sector. But basically, it is all about being respectful and doing a maximum in order not to identify individuals or focus on individuals, as Joelle was saying. I'm going to answer 2 or 3 little quick ones before we totally run out of time. One is, if you are a US company marketing to Canada, then you need to be compliant with Canadian digital compliance regulations. Canada has the anti-spam regulation in particular, but watch this space. It is moving rapidly to a lookalike of GDPR. GDPR applies to European people. So if they're Europeans in Canada that you're marketing to, then it applies to them. But if you're marketing directly just to Canadians, then GDPR doesn't apply. But the Canadian anti-spam does, and my bet is Canada will introduce the equivalent of a GDPR lookalike within a very short time. I'm going to call it now. We've done an hour. Thank you so much for your patience. Please, please, please fill out our survey. We've got lots more questions. We'll get back to you. Thank you so much for your time, Joelle. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.
And happy exporting. Be well, be happy. 2020 is here, and happy exporting, everybody. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.